When I close my eyes and meditate on peace, isn't it a beautiful sounding word? Peace. Just hearing it somehow calms my body and my spirit. When I close my eyes and meditate on peace and silently repeat the word to myself over and over again, the first image that always comes to mind is that beautiful image from space of the earth, that beautiful blue ball sitting there so quietly, so beautifully. A single planet, whole, and at least from a distance, at peace. I also sometimes reflect back on images from the world I've seen of old enemies or adversaries joining hands. Enemies who have fought one another for decades or centuries, but who have found a path to peace and reconciliation. I'm sorry to say I don't have a lot of those images in mind, but I have a few. And finally, I have to say that, and maybe this is my own minister bias here, that I also think about religious communities, houses of worship, places that are open and welcoming, communities that are reaching beyond their walls and into the world through acts of justice and compassion. And yes, I think about the Unitarian Universalist Church of Akron and how our values, our actions, our purpose connects to the work of peace. I have to say that I have felt in this congregation, especially in the last year, a growing passion for peace. I've seen it here on Sunday mornings. I did a little inventory as I was preparing this morning. This is actually the third service we've had in the last 5 months in which peace was the theme. And I also see our passion for peace, as Kim mentioned, in all of our wonderful social justice work. Peace is present in our immigration work as we reach out, build relationships, and stand on the side of love with immigrant families here in Northeast Ohio. Peace is most assuredly in the work we do as we seek to be good allies in the struggle for full and equal rights for the LGBTQ community. And I certainly feel peace in the work we are doing around food and food justice. In this extraordinary garden that we've planted, and here's where I'm directionally challenged. It's out that way, right? Every time I give somebody directions around here, I always try to point to the mall, and I'm pointing in the opposite direction or something. So that garden, that wonderful food, and especially what we did with the food a few weeks back when we went to a nearby church to their hot food site and fed 260 people on a Saturday morning and afternoon. As Eric mentioned in the announcements, we're going to have a wonderful celebration in the garden right after the service. In many ways, sort of our coffee hour will be outside in the garden today. There's going to be wonderful food served from some of the vegetables we've grown. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, the vegetables from our garden taste fantastic. So I hope you will join us after the service. But I have to say that as important as all of that work is, all the classes we've taught, the services we've held, the justice that we do, I still don't think that it's enough. I don't think it's enough in this community. I don't think we're doing enough in Unitarian Universalism. And to be perfectly honest, I don't feel that most of the world's religions, and that religion in general is doing enough to build peace. You see, while so many religions, including Unitarian Universalism, affirm the value of peace and a commitment to loving not only one's neighbors, but yes, even one's adversaries and enemies, too often that commitment gets lost or forgotten, silenced or ignored, as humanity repeatedly finds itself traveling down a path of war, of violence, of hatred, and of fear. Rather than boldly standing for peace in the face of all of that violence and war, religions throughout history, including this one, too often have allowed themselves to be caught up in an onslaught of nationalistic fervor and co-opted by a culture that not only permits, but actually glorifies and celebrates violence. When the drums of war and nationalism are beating loudest, religious voices that should be boldly pointing to the possibility and the necessity of a different world, a different ethic, and a different understanding of what it means to be a person of faith, and yes, a child of God, those voices are so often silent and passive. And in thinking about Unitarian Universalism, if I could point to one moment in our history that I think illustrates the failure of our religion to live up to its core value of peace, I would point to the way we acted in the days and weeks, and I would say years leading up to American involvement in the First World War. A few minutes ago, I read an excerpt from that extraordinary sermon by the Reverend John Haynes Holmes, which he delivered to his then Unitarian congregation. This, of course, happened decades before Unitarianism and Universalism came together as one religion. This was the sermon he delivered to his Unitarian congregation in New York City right after the United States declared war. I got to tell you, those words are decades old now, almost 100 years old. I still wonder if I would have the courage to stand up and speak them. That sermon has to be, if not the most important and courageous sermon I think that has ever been preached in Unitarian Universalism. Think about it for a moment. I haven't seen public opinion data for that era, but I would venture to say that levels of support for entering the war among the American people, and certainly among Haynes Holmes' own congregation, were off the charts and overwhelming. And anyone who questioned our involvement in that war was simply branded a traitor. Listen again to what he says, that what he believes the religious response to not only the First World War, but to all war and violence should be. In this church, if nowhere else, the enemy will still be included in the family of God's children. So long as I am your minister, this altar will be consecrated to brotherhood and sisterhood. And before it, we shall worship that God who created and who loves all humankind. Think for a minute about that ethic, that value, that understanding of who we are and why we're here that is at the heart of what he is saying. The enemy, no matter who they are, is a child of God. The purpose of religion is to affirm with boldness and courage the ultimate kinship of humankind. We are created out of the same substance, the same blood, the same divine image. Without question, there are differences among us, differences of language and culture, of faith and nationality, of age and gender and race and religion and sexual orientation. But all the great prophets of peace, Jesus, the Buddha, Muhammad, Gandhi, Dr. King, and John Haynes Holmes, and so many more, have taught us that those differences, which so often lead to violence and war, they pale in comparison to what we share and what we have in common. and that those differences must never be used as a justification or an excuse to fight or to kill. There is, at the heart of all religions, a recognition of a deep and primordial unity that binds human beings together, a unity that manifests itself in the shared ethical command to love thy neighbor as oneself. I wish I could tell you that the religious voices of peace have held sway throughout history, but sadly, that's not the case. The history of religion has been one of complicity, rationalization, and support for war and violence, and for values that accept and even justify a world of injustice and oppression. Let me give you an example from our tradition. Not long after John Haynes Holmes delivered his memorable sermon against the First World War, the then American Unitarian Association held its annual convention. Not surprisingly, the role of Unitarian congregations in the war effort was a hot topic of discussion. During the convention, Holmes presented a report in which he outlined what he saw as the differences of opinion within Unitarianism about the war. He urged the convention to honor our tradition's long respect for freedom of conscience and for encouraging diversity of opinion. He wasn't advocating that Unitarians take his stand or any single stand against the war. All he asked for was respect for those with different views than the majority. Well, Holmes's report provoked an angry and immediate response from the convention's moderator, former President of the United States, William Howard Taft. Taft argued that Unitarians had to speak with one voice in support of the war. To do otherwise was disloyal and unpatriotic and would give aid and comfort to the enemy. As Taft himself said, when our national house is on fire, it isn't proper to consider whether the firemen should use one kind of water or another. We've got to get behind one water to put this fire out, and that water is the water of war. I wish I could tell you that the convention rejected Taft's argument, and that there were countless voices like Holmes insisting that it was most assuredly proper for a religion that affirms human dignity and love of neighbor to object to a war that took millions of lives and that turned Taft's water into a river of blood. But instead, the convention passed a resolution overwhelmingly calling on all Unitarian congregations to support the war and authorizing the denomination to punish, meaning by withholding funding, from any church whose minister spoke out against it. And I'm so sorry to say that although Holmes's congregation did not comply with this resolution, countless others did. And there were a number of courageous ministers who lost their jobs. Now, I tell you this story because I think it points to what I believe is the failure of not only our tradition, but of most religions to stand consistently and courageously for peace. The record is not all negative. There have been individuals and instances throughout the history of religion in which we have proclaimed without equivocation that war and religion are not compatible, that war and religion are antithetical concepts, that violence is never a spiritual value, and that human beings are created first and foremost to love and cherish one another, and that one can never love one's neighbor while at the same time killing it or injuring him. So here's the question and the challenge I offer us today. As human beings who affirm the dignity and worth of all people, who see difference as a cause for celebration rather than as a reason to fear or fight, and who strive in everything we do to stand on the side of love and compassion, what can we do? What will we do? How will we live so as to create peace in our lives, in our communities, and in the world? We've made a good start in this congregation. We're doing wonderful, wonderful work for justice. And peace and justice are so closely connected. Think about that for a moment. Without peace in our own lives, in our communities, and in the world, justice is impossible. And without justice and respect for human dignity and human rights, peace is ultimately hollow and meaningless. But as wonderful as all of our existing work is, I think we need to be even more intentional in our efforts to create and build peace. If communities of faith like this one, communities that affirm universal and unconditional love of neighbor, if we don't speak out and stand boldly and unequivocally for peace in the midst of a world and a culture so drenched in violence, how will we ever live in the world we yearn for? I am convinced that if there is to be genuine and lasting peace in the world, it will only come through what Dr. King called a bold revolution of values, a revolution in which our loyalties, in which humankind's loyalties become, as he liked to say, universal and ecumenical rather than particular and sectional. And I am convinced, and I think Dr. King was as well, that such a revolution in values must be led by us, by the churches, by the temples, the synagogues, the mosques, the sanghas, by communities of faith committed to love of neighbor, to justice, and to peace. So how will we do it? What's the next step? I don't have a bold answer to propose to you this morning, but I've got an invitation for you. In a few weeks, a few Sundays, I believe it's October the 14th, in fact, our social action folks, I see Sarah sitting back there, are going to hold a wonderful potluck and conversation about the social justice work of the church. Be an opportunity to talk more about immigration, LGBTQ rights, food justice, and so on. And I think this could be an opportunity as well for those of you who are ready to stand for peace, who are ready to help this congregation be a bold and courageous voice for peace. I hope you'll come to that potluck and that conversation. Maybe the next step is to launch a peace ministry in this church. Maybe we need a peace group that coordinates with all of our other ministries to be a bold and courageous force for peace. Maybe that's the next step. So I hope you'll join us on that Sunday after church. I know this for sure. The road to peace in our lives and peace in the world, it won't be easy. It's long and it will be difficult. There is so much war, so much violence, so much hatred. The voices of hate and intolerance, they are so loud. They are so persistent. And I think they are so loud and so persistent that we've come to be adjusted to them, that we have come to view them as being natural and inevitable. Dr. King used to say, we need to be maladjusted to violence, maladjusted to injustice. And I think if Unitarian Universalism, and if so many of the world's religions teach us anything, it is that humankind was created more than anything else to love one another and to live together in peace. Dr. King used to like to say that we are caught in a network of mutuality and tied in a single garment of destiny. As people of faith who affirm the dignity and worth of the entire human family, we are called to create peace, to speak out for peace, and to work together for peace. So let's let this day be a beginning. Let it be a moment when we say enough to all the violence and the bloodshed, when we say enough to all the fear and the hatred. Let this be a day for reaching out, for beginning to heal old wounds, and for joining with all of our brothers and sisters, all of our cousins and nephews, around the table of love, of friendship, and of peace. Thank you so much for listening, and blessed be.